Hello, good evening. It is our very good pleasure to be lecturing this evening for the Night of Philosophy in Tel Aviv. I'm Joseph Cohen. This is Raphael Zagury-Orly. Needs no introduction, obviously, to this panel or forum. We will be presenting a paper, which will be followed by discussion, entitled A Justice for History. This paper will revolve around Heidegger's idea of history, philosophy of history, and we will try to propose in the concluding remarks of this very short or shortened paper this evening a novel manner of looking at the question of history, at the problem of history, which we will label by an analysis through the topics of crisis, apocalypse, and subsequently we will seek to deploy or develop a historical subjectivity which is traversed by what we will call in a very Derridian manner the spectral or specters.
Or the living dead.
Or the living dead, to be more precise, always pertaining to the singularity of historical events. But before we get into those concluding remarks, I'm going to give it over to Raphael, give the floor over to Raphael, who will lead us into our reflection, and we will hopefully be concluding with a discussion with the public.
Okay, so this reflection will revolve around that which returns and that which arrives in history. Returns and arrives in history. Following this approach to history and of historical events, the traditional dichotomies or classical concepts of the philosophy of history, that is, contingency and necessity, particularity and universality, accident and essence, destiny, teleology, reason in history, eschatology, etc., etc., will appear rather inappropriate. Indeed, we will attempt to develop a relation to history capable of engaging with the singularity of events, as Joseph just said, which is precisely to say those events which return to us, return from the past, and arrive from the future to incessantly haunt our present. So again, we'll be engaging with the singularity of events, which is precisely to say those events which return from the past and arrive from the future. We shall seek to deploy the philosophical signification of the Derridian idea of the specter, of spectrality, in order to approach those events which return to our present as if they arrived from the future, and those events arriving to our present from the future which remain impossible to simply put in the past. In this respect, the traditional dichotomies just mentioned will be seen to emerge from one apparently unshakable and unquestionable opposition, which we are here to deconstruct, namely the opposition between life and death, between the living and the dead. Our attempt, therefore, to develop a novel approach of history, one which tackles the irreducible singularity of historical events, both past and future, will also entail and engage in a rethinking of the dichotomy between life and death, between what is meant by the living and what is meant by the dead, both past and future. Historical events, according to us, relentlessly produce specters. Specters which take hold of our present and for which the different economies and signifiers through which they are rendered graspable, representable, archivable, and treatable in a general narrative of reason or meaning, and where historical consciousness can furnish the conditions of possibility to come to terms with these very events and history as a whole, will appear inoperative. We will demonstrate how and why the present, and hence our relation to the representation of our historical present, remain perpetually out of joint and haunted by a disarticulation of temporality. On the one hand, past historical events incessantly returning to our present as futural, and on the other, future events arriving as irreducible to the treatment of a historical representation, always capable of inscribing the event itself in our past. That is to say, comprehending it in a general historical narrative. Our question, therefore, can be formulated in the following manner. What occurs to the representation of our present when it is assailed indistinctly and undecidedly by that which incessantly returns to it from the past as that which arrives to it from the irreducible future? What occurs to the idea and comprehension of history and subsequently to our historical subjectivity when these are exposed to a type of temporality where both the possibility of a commemorative remembrance and that of all future anticipation are constantly overflowed by specters? Just think of the Israeli context, the overflowing of specters from the Shoah. Neither absent the specter, remember, neither absent nor present, and yet also absent and present, neither simply presently living, nor simply absently dead, and yet also both living and dead in some way. The specter whose return and arrival to our historical representation dislocates and disrupts, interrupts, interposes the dialectic of recognition and reconciliation, as Hegel would say, as well as the ontological appropriation of history, as Heidegger would say. How are we to rethink and relate to history when historical events, both past and future, in their irreducible, unclassifiable, unarchivable singularity, command a responsibility unassimilable to the recognition, comprehension, reconciliation of time within the speculative dialectic of reason, or to the sojourning and dwelling in the truth of the history of being? These questions are eminently political as they concern the very foundations of democratic rationality in its relation to history, and command a renewed manner of approaching the spectralities which at once return and arrive to our historical present, and for which the economies of memory, truth, reconciliation are seen to produce against themselves logics of forgetfulness, logics of just the justification of atrocities in history. So every reflection on our relation to the philosophy of history today, and more generally to history and historical events, cannot avoid engaging with at least the three following phenomena: catastrophe, nihilism, and technology. So firstly, the singularity of catastrophe, both past and future in history, recalls here the various genocidal atrocities and wars in human history. To name here but a very few number of these amongst all other singular catastrophic events in our history: World War I, which produced an impoverishment of experience, according to Walter Benjamin; the Shoah, radically and brutally posing in the history of philosophy the question of representability and irrepresentability, of historical singularity, of possible impossible testimony, of systematic mass murder, and, to use the Lukashian expression, the destruction of reason, of the possible impossible recollection of memory, and, by extension, commemoration, possible impossible reparation, mourning, and forgiveness. And the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, which created a new threat for humankind, namely its complete annihilation, closely related to the question of technology and of the future of catastrophes, downing on our historical present, the environmental disaster threatening to undermine the grounds of our material existence, as well as the menace of yet a further and inevitably greater nuclear cataclysm, so clearly typified by Günther Anders. So to this list, which is bound to remain endless, we must also add the multiple, diverse, massive histories of slavery and colonialism in human history, which in turn pose with renewed relevance in the 20th century, the philosophical and sociological question of the status of Western rationality in the face of alterity, otherness, difference, and furthermore, the question of the manner in which this rationality has politically dealt with alterity. Secondly, we must not neglect or minimize the relevance of nihilism, of the nihilism pervading our present political and societal or even philosophical contexts. For many, nihilism has become a bygone question framed in the history of the philosophical tradition or debate. However, according to us, nihilism today is prevalent, and the exhaustion of values and norms, as well as the growing impossibility of fixing or setting renewed values and norms for our political and societal situation, is indicative of a generalizable collapse of the capacity of humankind to reinvent itself beyond the repetition of conventional but used up schemas of meaning and signification. Indeed, have we yet posed the question of contemporary nihilism in its diverse and different effects on our political and societal becoming? Have we yet addressed how and why nihilism has come to pervade the very modalities by which our rationality has treated and dealt with historical events? Have we yet grasped how and why philosophical rationality is productive precisely of nihilism by seeking to overcome nihilism through the establishment of sovereign values, norms based on presumed capacity to collect and assemble the multiple singularities of existence into a generalizable community of reason or unified horizon of meaning? Thirdly, the development of technology actively inframing the possibilities of thinking and thereby reducing these to ordering, norming, corrective and instrumental rationality could engage in what Anders called provocatively, yet at the same time highly significatively, the obsolescence of mankind. We turn to Anders in the reflection to mark the radical difference between his thinking and Heidegger's ontological analysis of technology. Indeed, for Anders, and we consider him as only one among many examples of thinkers who have actively criticized Heidegger's ontological analysis, the nuclear catastrophe and cataclysm stemming from the all too rapid and uncontrollable development of technology represents the symbol of the complete self-destruction of human life, whereas for Heidegger, the planetary devastation of technology marks an occasion, this is the apocalyptical logic, an occasion or even chance to engage in a turn, kehre, towards the essential clearing, Lichtung, of the meaning and the truth of being, where the former sees the menace of complete destruction of mankind by mankind, the latter, Heidegger, perceives the apocalyptic occasion for yet a further possibility for mankind to re-engage with being itself. Catastrophe, nihilism, technology, these three phenomena tightly woven together and rethought in the light of the irreplaceable singularity of human existence, and in the face of an idea of justice, irreducible to normative judgment, moral values, or the predominant logic of our courts of law, require us to rethink our relation to history. These phenomena require a reformulation of historical temporality, which would, in the sense, resolutely depart from the structure of crisis, actively ordering the critical philosophy of history, from Kant to Husserl and Habermas. These three phenomena also point to a novel idea of history, which notably parts with the speculative dialectic of historical recognition and reconciliation in Hegel, which also distinctly diverging from the dispositive of the apocalyptic logic of history, which we will be illustrating by focusing on Heidegger and especially on his analysis on technology. So the two central motives by which our philosophical tradition has comprehended history, grasped, seized the meaning of historical events, can be understood according to two fundamental signifiers. On the one hand, and Joseph, you will explain that, the structure of crisis, and on the other, the apocalyptic logic. These two signifiers contain different discursive modalities of giving, of donation, of giving meaning to historical becoming, distinctive logics to grasp the development of signification in history, and thereby to deploy unique conception of historical temporality. Indeed, in each of these lie powerful economies of sense, economies of meaning, and signification and justification, which furnish the ground and foundation whereby historical events are seized, are interiorized, and ultimately brought to a general narrative of historical meaning.
Now, as Raphael just pointed out, the two main directing lines of the philosophy of history are the dispositives, I would say, of crisis and apocalypse. Crisis, on the one hand, of course, stemming in modern philosophy, most particularly in Hegel. Crisis is conceived as that moment which inevitably calls on to its supersession. That is, inevitably calls on to it being relieved from the critical moment, from that critical instance, into the possibility of weaving once again the narrative of history by which the critical moment makes sense, enters into a signification of history, and thereby restructures a historical signification. On the one hand, therefore, crisis, this moment which is a break in the historical narrative of a given history, is superseded by a narrative of meaning which comprehends it and deploys it into a greater orientation or intention. On the other hand, apocalypse, the moment of apocalypse, as the word itself is marking it, is tributary of a truth function, I would say, a truth function by which apocalyptic logic reveals something of the truth of history. Reveals something of the truth of history, and therefore the apocalyptical moment calls for a turn, a radical turn in history, whereby is provoked another beginning of history. That is, another possibility for history to come to terms with its past. Our attempt here, and you will have understood that through crisis, that is, through a Hegelian dialectic, again, by which crisis is relieved from the critical moment into a general narrative of history, or an apocalyptic moment, understood here through a Heideggerian philosophy of history, whereby the truth of being is revealed, and key word here for apocalypse is this idea of revelation, is revealed the very truth, the very essence of history. Our idea here, our attempt, is to suggest an entirely other manner of looking at history. An entirely other manner of looking at history that is, and to put it straightforwardly as possible, to interrupt and suspend the very binary determinations which are at work in both the critical element of history and the apocalyptic logic that could structure a philosophy of history. To suspend and interrupt the binary determination of, and this is a very important point, of death and life. Our attempt here is to suspend and interrupt the binary determination of dying and living, of life capable of comprehending death, of dying capable of giving meaning to life, thereby suspending and interrupting the economy of both the history of the truth of being, revealed in an apocalyptic logic as Heidegger's, or a critical dialectic of history as revealed in Hegel's philosophy of history, in order to pinpoint, that is, in order to mark a singular historical responsibility, that is, singularly responding to both the singularity of past deaths and the singularity of lives to come. Singularity of past deaths or singularity of lives to come, which are not appropriable in the binary schema of death and life. That's the idea by which we are conducting or attempting to conduct here, following Derrida, of course. That is the idea of the specter. The specter is that singularity which is irreducible to the properly determined life and death dichotomy, in order to instigate another mode of historical subjectivity, another mode of historicity, whereby, far from being grounded in the existential aperture of the truth of being, to speak like Heidegger, the past dead and the lives to come are incessantly dismantling, destructuring, deconstructing the binary and traditional distinction between life and death maintained throughout the history of philosophy from Plato to Heidegger. It is as though our historical subjectivity were incessantly pervaded, this is a key point for us, incessantly pervaded by the multiple returns and occurrences of past lives and deaths, as well as future living and dying, exposed to multiple returns of past deaths and lives as occurrences, singular, from a future that cannot be anticipated. A futurity, therefore, of living and dying, which remain non-integrable into a past. That is, into a philosophical determination of crisis, into a philosophical determination of apocalyptic, and therefore mark the undecidability between life and death, undecidability between the life and the death of those past and those yet to come amongst us. In this sense, what we are seeking here is a deconstructive undecidability between past and death, between past deaths and lives, never passing into a historical narrative of the past, and lives and death to come, always occurring singularly in the historical present. That's our aim. What do we mean by a historical subjectivity which would remain exposed to both past and future, and where no distinction could predetermine the difference between past deaths and lives and deaths to come. What do we mean by a historical subjectivity exposed to the incessant returns of past deaths and lives? What do we understand by the idea of a historical subjectivity exposed to the singular arrivals of the living dying to come? These questions, of course, are closely interconnected, and for Derrida, further linked to the past historical catastrophes, Shoah, colonialism, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, etc., and to catastrophes yet to come, the nuclear catastrophe, the climactic catastrophe, the ecological disasters. Both past and future, both past death lives and living dying to come, return and arrive to this historical subjectivity outside or beyond the distinction between lived presence and the absence initiated by or in death. Hence, what we mean is a wholly other form of responsibility. A wholly other form of responsibility, which again is not reducible to the critical form of responsibility or the apocalyptic form of responding to this other beginning brought on by the revelation of the essence of history, as in the apocalyptic logic. In other words, what we are seeking is a hyperbolical responsibility towards both past death lives and living dying to come, where an undecidability between life and death, that is, between both past and future, both past and yet to come, in this sense, disclose a form of responsibility towards the singularity of both the return of past death lives and the arrival of living dying to come. A historical subjectivity, therefore, whose responsibility presupposes no ground, no foundation, no established norm or determined value. That is a responsibility without any horizon of meaning. That is a responsibility that cannot rely on a horizon of meaning. A responsibility, therefore, without any identification or recognition based on the dichotomy between life and death, between living and dying, between presence and absence, between the effectiveness and ineffectiveness, between living and dying, therefore, that is, between living and non-living, between authenticity and inauthenticity, to retain here the Heideggerian topology. This form of responsibility, far from inaction or inertia, far from mystifying exceptionality or incomprehension, leads to an excess and a surplus, a supplement, to speak like Derrida, of responsible action for and undecidedly past death lives and living dying to come. This entails, therefore, a singular responsibility towards events in history, as it marks the space where this historical subjectivity is required to respond without depending on the assurance of an ontology, which always appropriates the events of history as the essential movement of the truth of being, or relying on the guarantee of a dialectical reason in history, that is, of the whole schema of a critique of history. We thus seek to dismantle the traditional dichotomy between life and death in order to promote a way of thinking about history which would require our historical subjectivity to never put the past in the past or reduce the future to a simple present, not yet present. Through this diachronie of temporality, which Raphael was hinting at in the beginning of this talk, this diachronie of temporality would awaken a certain form of responsibility which would remain radically exposed at once and simultaneously, undecidedly thus, to past death lives and to living dying to come, as incessantly returning and arriving by cleaving and splicing the meaning of the historical present, of the past as past present, and of the future future present as future present, thereby leading to a renewed response to the singularities of both these returns and arrivals. Indeed, Derrida affirms the singularity of the specter, both past and to come, which demands, in what we have called the positivity of deconstruction in the face of history, a hyperbolic responsibility, a hypercriticism, if you would like. And I quote you Derrida, this non-presence of the specter demands that one take its time and its history into consideration, the singularity of its temporality or of its historicity. Of course, there is a radical critique here at work of Heidegger, and most particularly of Heidegger's account of technology, because as it could be very, very well portrayed, we don't have the time here to portray it, but it could be very easily portrayed that Heidegger's thinking of history is or remains trapped in a dispositive of technology. Of course, this would engage a radical critique of Heidegger's understanding of history, Heidegger's idea of history, Heidegger's idea of planetary technology in framing therefore the truth of being, but calling at the same time a salvation beyond that in framing. Of course, it will require us to ask of Heidegger, what is left of singularity in Heidegger's thinking? What is left of singularity in Heidegger's thinking of history when all historical events are already seen as being delimited by the confines of the determined play of the history of being, where all that returns and arrives of the event is already situated, placed, and consigned within this over-determination between the enframing of technology and the apocalyptic revelation of the history of the truth of being. What we, however, would like to mark is a wholly other experience of mourning, one that is singularly aporetic. A mourning, an experience of mourning, which is without telos or eschaton, and incessantly engaging more than one aporia in the experience of mourning itself. These questions disclose a certain type of impossible mourning of history. That is a type of exposition to the incessant returns of past death lives and ceaseless occurrences of the living dying to come, which return and occur both always in advance and already too late for the possibility of inscribing these in an experience or representation, a presence, a destiny, a history, a meaning in history. In advance and too late, arriving and returning without being determined by a presence and without being confined to an irrepresentability of absence, this impossible mourning of history, this impossible commemoration of history, would arise each time singularly, without these returns of past death lives and occurrences of future living dying being appropriated or appropriable within the confines or limits of truth, without engaging their denegation in a type of mourning work or work of mourning. I want to close on the idea, very important to Derrida, very important to us, what Derrida calls surviving. It is another experience of survival where this haunted historical subjectivity is incessantly exposed. It is another experience of surviving our history to which this haunted historical subjectivity is incessantly exposed, that is, exposed to the returns and arrivals of past deaths, lives, and the living dying to come, whilst always and perpetually invoking them. This haunted historical subjectivity is invoking the specters of history to come to it as if they were coming to it for the first time. What we have is the undecidability between exposition and invocation, which awakens our haunted historical subjectivity wholly otherwise than in the delimitation of life and death by properly dying and by the authentic lived experience. Our haunted historical subjectivity remains therefore exposed to the perpetual and each time singular reiteration of plural aporias, which affect the distinction between life and death, as well as the categories of the self and the other, the distinction between authentic and inauthentic, the difference between presence and absence, the difference between law and grace, the revealed but also the secret, identity and difference, and ultimately the idea of history. As Derrida remarks against, whilst identifying the point where the determined concepts of history, Kantian, crisis, Hegelian, speculative, or Heideggerian ontological, negate the movement of history itself, and hence fail each time by appropriating them within their own most determinations in order to think the singularity of historical events, the specters returning from these, as well as from the future living dying arriving each time in these, this law would signify the following to us. I quote Derrida, in the same place, on the same limit, where history is finished, there where a certain determined concept of history comes to an end, precisely there the historicity of history begins. There finally it has the chance of heralding itself, of promising itself. This other historicity of history heralds a responsibility which has none of the features of a paralysis or a failure, and whose type of hyperbolic questioning remains without reserve or restraint. This is a surplus of responsibility which is being called for, a surplus of responsibility each time singularly exceeding the responsibility capable of assuming itself as responsible, whether through its foundation in an autonomous subject or through its appropriation in the speculative teleology of reason in history, or again, always and already responding to the ontological eschatology of the history of the truth of being. In this sense, we have the idea of a must, whereby our haunted historical subjectivity must dismantle each time singularly all the conditions of possibility where the experience, the essence, the presence, the truth, the being of X are said or could be said, and where this dismantling, this destructuring, far from interrupting action, would awaken it wholly otherwise than in the horizon of a comprehension of the truth of history. It is as though the responsibility of this singular must always responded in a dual fashion, at once and simultaneously, liberating action whilst at the same time constraining it. That is, liberating action whilst depriving action of any justification or self-justification and assured ground, thereby depriving it of all refuge in the horizon of truth or reason in history. By liberating and denying action each time, liberating action, but denying the self-justification of action, freeing it of all limits and delimitations whilst restraining it to reveal its inherent perjury, which brings it back to the limits and delimitations it ensures. Deconstruction enjoins an incessant aporetization which, without recourse to any value or norm, yet not without denying the value of the normative, never ceases to reformulate itself. And perhaps that's the most important point. The never ceasing of reformulation. Never ceasing to reformulate itself singularly in the face of each historical, political, or philosophical event. The positivity of deconstruction compels, therefore, a perpetual invention of more than one aporia for each historical, political, or philosophical event. Facing each time a singular event, the positivity of deconstruction incessantly invents and reinvents more than one singularity. More than one singularity through each singularity in order to approach it justly, and through its multiple aporias, deploy the act of a singular justice in each singularity, a singular justice which does not found or ground itself in its self-justification, but which always responds more, always exceeds its response of responsibility towards each and every singular historical event in our history. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions? Still none. What do we do, Joseph? Do we say good night? No questions?
I think one of the most important points here is to mark. We can have a talk about this. I think is to really mark that our task here is to develop a novel type of historical subjectivity. I mean, we don't have anything against historical subjectivity, its own history, which has itself a singular history. But what we're seeking, in a way, is to extract or abstract out of the determinations of historical subjectivity, determinations whether they be marked by crisis, whether they be marked by a logic of an apocalyptic logic of revelation of the truth of history, in order to compel this haunted, traumatized historical subjectivity to respond incessantly more than what it can respond, incessantly exceed what it responds, its own responsibility.
Yeah. So I think, as you say, it's not about thinking against the historical subjectivity or the different multiple determinations of the historical subjectivity in philosophy. It is really I mean, there are a few things we could say. First of all would be, I think that for us, the question we have to deal with, and that for some reason or for many reasons or for many complicated reasons we cannot really go into right now, philosophy has abandoned, or philosophy as it continues right now has abandoned. We think that we must confront the question of nihilism. There is something like an exhaustion of our conventional, dominant, powerful, extremely sophisticated conceptions of history, understandings of history, our manners of signifying history. We think that there is we are confronted with a very deep form of exhaustion of these logics. We gave two main, very dominant motives, dispositives of these rationality in history, which is the logic of crisis and the logic of apocalypse. Our thesis is to say that in many ways, most of the history of philosophy goes under these two determinations. Right. Obviously, Heidegger is not Hegel, and Hegel is not Kant, and so on and so forth. But you could see how crisis works, obviously, within Kant, who's the philosopher of crisis and of critical reason, and in the Hegelian dialectics. And then Heidegger's critique of Kant and Hegel, he's done through the apocalyptic conception and logic of history. So this is why we had to go through this reading of these two logics, of these two dispositives, as you say, and to really try to understand how they work and how they function and how they think and interiorize and justify all events in history, all catastrophes, all traumas, all disasters, and so on and so forth. And then the question is, so what happens when we deconstruct these logics? We are confronted with a form of exposition to another type of subjectivity and other types of events. We are much less armed in some ways in facing these events, and this is why we have to je pense que c'est fini. Je pense que c'est fini. Comme ça? Bah, oui, mais c'est pas apparu. Ah non, peut-être qu'ils sont encore là. I don't know. Do we have 2 more minutes left? It's very hard to say. I mean, I'm not getting any info. So once you deconstruct these two very strong dispositives, as you say, these two strong motives of the history of philosophy, you are faced with a different kind of subjectivity and also a different way of approaching the event.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so this is where the concept of responsibility intervenes, a novel concept of responsibility.
Yeah, novel concept of subjectivity also.
Yes.
Novel concept of subjectivity, novel concept of responsibility, novel concept life of past, of life and death, of future, a diachronic temporality, which is not organized or structured through the traditional dichotomies of temporality, presence, present, past, and future. There's a whole other spectrum that opens up. So yeah, that's extremely interesting, and that's precisely the point where we're seeking to expose this subjectivity, deconstructed subjectivity, to a form of positivity, yes. The positivity of deconstruction, expose this subjectivity to a form of positivity, and thereby define or redefine its relation to history.
So this is the positivity of deconstruction.
In a way,
you see, deconstructing is a very positive act. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Obviously, we don't know who followed us, how many people followed us, but we thank you without seeing you, dear spectators. Bye.
Have a great night.
Have a good night.